Hey friends, welcome back to another Field and Garden podcast. It is your host and friend, Lisa Mason Ziegler, and thanks so much for choosing us today to take a listen. I know you have a lot of choices and we appreciate that. And so before we jump in today's delightful show discussing tulips, which is such a favorite topic of so many, I just want to remind everybody that this podcast is brought to you by thegardenersworkshop.com, where you can learn more about the work that we're doing and all that we offer over there, from our online courses to the garden shop to just a boatload of free resources. And, we just appreciate when you do need supplies or to expand your horizons that you consider us, because that's what helps us to provide all this free content for you guys. Folks, I am delighted today to have Gretel Adams of Sunny Meadows Flower Farm joining me here from Columbus, Ohio. Hi, Gretel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, it is such a pleasure. Gretel and her husband, Steve, have been longtime friends of mine, and they are full-time, full-fledged flower farmers. And so we thought, this is airing in the end of near March. The end of March. And so we thought we would talk about tulips and pre-chilling. And Gretel was kind enough to make an information sheet, which will be available to you in the show notes, her download for that. So Gretel, let's first off just introduce yourself for anybody that may not be familiar with you guys and your business.
Yeah, so I'm Gretel Adams. My husband Steve and I have Sunny Meadows Flower Farm. We're in Columbus, Ohio. We grow on probably about 20 acres. We have like 17 greenhouses, half of which are heated. So our season is about March through November with cut flowers. We do Christmas wreaths in December, and then January, February, most of our sales are like dahlia tubers online. So that's kind of what sustains our like year round. It started out just the two of us were first generation farmers. So everything that we do is based on things that we've learned along the way. Neither of us went to school for agriculture. Learned through mentors and learned through mistakes. So that's why teaching is like so important to us, is just because if we can like kind of pass some things on that we've learned, so that other people sort of have a starting point, then hopefully it will make it easier for them if they are also, trying to make the transition into agriculture. So, it started out just the two of us on a quarter acre kind of homestead vibe. We had pigs, ducks, chickens. We grew vegetables. We had a CSA. I made soap. Like we kind of did a little bit of everything. But
that's so funny.
Yeah.
It's what we all do, right? You just kept figuring out. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now at this point, we have about 25 employees during the season. And during the winter, it goes down to about half of that, because half of our staff are H2A, so they go home for the winter. So the business has really grown from the beginning. We started in 2006, so this is year 16.
Wow.
17.
Wow.
Yeah, feels like it's been a long time.
So the bottom line is that you know a lot about growing flowers, and in particular, tulips are a really big crop for you guys, right?
Yeah. So we do both outdoor tulips, for their regular timing, and then we also do pre-chilled tulips, which start for us. Our goal is to start right after Valentine's Day, just because it's hard for us to compete with the Valentine's Day needs that people need to pre-book so far ahead of time.
Right.
But this year we did end up having the tulips and the anemones ended up coming on right for Valentine's Day. So we did end up having a few buckets of flowers for Valentine's Day, but the goal is March, to hit that early March.
And so when you say that, not everybody understands. So what she's saying is most commercial customers want to book their Valentine's Day flowers far in advance, so they know they have them to secure them. And that's not something that you can guarantee when your flowers are going to come in, right? I mean, there's just a lot of factors on that, because everybody's like, oh gosh, wonder why they wouldn't want to do Valentine's. Well, it's not that you don't want to, it's that it's just difficult, right? For a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, it's hard to promise specific like quantities and stuff. And even though the greenhouses are heated that these tulips grow in, we're pretty gray and cloudy in Ohio in the winter. And so, you know, you need sun for things to bloom. So even if we try to hit that timing with planting them at the right time and getting them rooted and stuff like that, it still is a challenge. I would rather not promise somebody something and then surprise have flowers than over promise and not be able to make things bloom in the spring. So we're usually pretty conservative in the spring with our projections of like not actually selling something until it starts to bloom. Like right now, we've got a lot of ranunculus buds out there. This is the end of February, and yeah, so like I've just learned through experience, like you get really excited because you're like, yay, flowers are about to happen, and then you put them on the list and then you sell them, and then you have a few cloudy days and then nothing opens up, and then you have to disappoint people that you sold stuff to that wasn't really blooming. So yeah, we try to err on the side of caution in the spring, just because we can't control the weather. So
that's so very, very true. So we wanted to kind of talk today a little bit about what are called pre-chilled tulips. So can you tell, for those people that don't know what that is, can you kind of give us a rundown on what that means?
Yeah, so pre-chilled tulips are tulips that have been given a cooling treatment so that they think that they've already gone through winter. So all tulips need a cooling period to be dormant and to kind of like cycle through their life cycle to be ready to bloom in the spring. And so we do that naturally when we plant them outside in October, and they bloom in April for us typically here. But you can also force them into thinking that they went through winter. So the pre-chilled tulips come to us, they've already been chilled by the supplier, and are ready to like root for the rest of their process, the rest of their life cycle.
And so why would somebody want to do that? I mean, first off, does it have to be indoors in a greenhouse? And why would they want to do that?
So some people use pre-chilled if your climate is warmer and you don't know whether or not they're going to get enough cold in the winter. So some places further south will use pre-chilled outside or use pre-chilled in like an unheated greenhouse, just to make sure that they get enough cooling. But we are using them in a heated space to extend the season. So it allows us to have flowers end of February, beginning of March through when the outdoor tulips happen, which is typically beginning mid of April for us. So it just extends the tulip season. If you have tulips outside, for us, typically it gets pretty warm in May pretty quick. So our tulip season, as far as the outdoor bloom time, is only like 3 or 4 weeks. And so it kind of gives us a big like crunch of, you know, you've got to sell. We plant outdoors, we plant 75,000 tulips. So like that's a lot of tulips to sell in that amount of time. And so indoors, I think it's we have about like 10 or 15,000 that we do indoors, and we have multiple successions. And so it's kind of starts off slow, and then that leads us into tulip season. So people are already kind of primed in buying their tulips from us. And we try and grow all the like specialty varieties so that it's not just your standard like single tulip that the florist can get for cheap, or you know, that they would usually see in the grocery store, something special.
And so you said you succession plant them. So what does that look like? Do you get them shipped to you all at one time, or are they sprinkled out, or you just get them and hold them in a cooler, or how does that work?
So we get them We have 3 different successions, so we get 3 separate shipments because they require a certain number of weeks of cooling. They're going to the supplier that's chilling them is chilling them for us based on when they're getting shipped out. So we use Leo Burby Bulb Company there in Marysville, so we can actually go pick them up from them. But there are other, they can also ship, and there's other suppliers who will chill them too. So, but we've been working with them because they're close to us, and they're trying to develop their like pre-chilled program to have it be more accessible to other growers, and also find like what are the best varieties for specific times of the year. So they were actually just here today to come check on all their tulips and see how things were rooting and blooming and stuff. So they're going to, and every variety also has a specific number of chilling weeks that it needs. So let's say something that's like a single early variety, like Salmon Impression is a Darwin, that one doesn't require as many cooling weeks. So even for them, they're working backwards as far as, crop planting stuff. If we were to go by the week numbers, which is how we do stuff, week 51 is our first like succession that we receive. So if you're not familiar with week numbers, that'd be the week before Christmas, the week before the end of the year, because there's 52 weeks in the year. And so those tulips then, let's say I order 10 different varieties. Each one of those varieties might have a different number of cooling weeks that it needs. So when they put it in the cooler, it might be different based on, when I need them. So it kind of starts all the way back in the process. Charles from Jansen Overseas was here today. That's who they get the tulip bulbs from. And he was showing me his crop planning part of it, which means they come out of the field for him in the summer and then get shipped in like September. So that way they can get the number of cooling weeks that they need in order for us to get them like planted in December. So it's like, seeing the other end of the cycle was pretty interesting, of just like, wow, the tulips that are blooming right now got dug in his field like the end of July. So just like the whole process was really interesting to actually like think about the life cycle of that bulb.
And I think what else is coming really clear for me is I know there are people out there saying, oh, well, I bet I could chill my own bulbs. Do you know what I mean? It is not as simplistic. It's kind of like starting Lizzie seeds. Getting Lizzie's to germinate is not the problem. It is keeping them at the right temperature so they don't rosette. And you know what I mean? It's like, it is so much deeper than what you actually think. All right. So you get 3 different shipments, and that allows you a succession plan. And then I guess on top of that, there's different varieties that have different layouts of how many days they actually have. So
within those successions, we have some that are early, mid, and late. So it kind of also successions based on the varieties. So like, Salmon Impression is something that's one of the first ones, and Avant-Garde. Columbus is kind of one of the like mid ones, and then something like Finola is always the latest one. So it's like even within that succession, by choosing different varieties, we're also kind of staggering that bloom time too.
All right. So I've got some questions that have been brought to me by other flower farmers and people on our team. So where can people get pre-chilled tulips, and how do you know if they're pre-chilled? I'm going to guess and say you pay more when they're pre-chilled. That's the first way you'll know how they're pre-chilled, right?
Yeah. So you can get them from Burby, or also Edney sells them. I think Awning sells pre-chilled tulips as well. So you would have to specifically order them as that. There are 2 different kinds of pre-chilled tulips. There's what we do are called the 5-degree tulips. So that's Celsius. So that basically means that they've gotten most of their cooling. They only need like a 2 or 3 week rooting period, and then they're ready to go. There's also 9-degree tulips, and those tulips require more cooling before they root, before they're ready. So for us, we choose the 5-degree tulips, which they're a little bit more expensive, but because we don't want to have to do more cooling ourselves, we would rather them just be ready to go when they get to us. We choose the 5-degree ones. So that means we can root them for just 2 or 3 weeks, and then they start to get that top growth. So you plant them in the crates and then put them in a cooler, or because we're cloudy here, we're able to root them in the greenhouse on the ground. And we use like black plastic and a piece of white plastic over top so that they're in the dark. So they need to be watered in and then be in the dark for 3 weeks. There's also more on our Instagram page. We talk a lot about the process. There's a full like video of us covering and uncovering and planting and stuff. So yeah, if you want more details, the Sunny Meadows Flower Farm Instagram does have kind of our process of how we do it. But yeah, so we use the 5-degree tulips, and they would be listed that way with the supplier.
So first off, we'll put in the show notes a link to Gretel's social media. I mean, you definitely want to follow her on Instagram because they do post some amazing videos about what's going on their farm. They're different. I mean, just all the different aspects. I still can remember watching when you guys were using that. I forget what kind of machine it was that Steve turned into a tulip planter, that one that circled. Oh my gosh. I mean, so it's very innovative and really interesting.
It's a garlic planter. Yeah.
That's what it is, a garlic planter that planted tulips. So what you just said a minute ago, so you all plant them on the crate, you put them on the ground, you put black plastic, and then you said you put white plastic. Is that to keep it cool? And to keep it, okay.
Yeah, so rooting, you want them to be around 50 degrees. So black plastic, if you're sunny, is gonna make it too warm underneath there for them to root. So the white plastic helps reflect the sun. But what we found was a single white plastic. It was still getting light through the white plastic by itself. Okay. So that's why we do both. Or if you had a thick sheet of white plastic, that would probably work. But yeah, and so you just want them to be in the dark for 2 weeks. Basically, you don't want them to be growing the bottom and growing the top at the same time. So you want the roots to be established. The way that Burby described it to me today when they were here was you want them to have good feet to stand on. So you want them to have like the roots to be established before they start trying to grow that top growth. So if you've ever grown tulips and they bloomed like this tall, that probably means that they were rooting and growing on the top at the same time. And so they don't have enough energy to do both. So you want to make sure they have good roots and then they start to sprout.
And you know, you did mention earlier, but I just want to highlight it for anybody out there. Those folks that are in the South, which I'm right on the border of where I'm talking about, where you might not get a long enough cold period during the winter to actually plant outdoor tulips, you know, in the fall, like everybody does, because there's not enough cold period. And so I saw Dave counseling some poor person on social media that showed a picture of so many tulips, Gretel, that were this tall, and they weren't just budded, they were blowing. And that he said where I forget where she was, but he said, you know, they just didn't get enough cooling. They didn't get rooted in. So
and we've even had times here where we have a mild winter or there's enough snow cover, and some of those early varieties outdoors don't get enough cooling for us. So outdoors, we cut out a lot of the early varieties just for that purpose. Also because we're trying to save them mostly for Mother's Day. So for us, the mids and the lates, that in our outdoor planting, we can save until Mother's Day. So they have more value to us anyways. But yeah, a lot of the early ones, sometimes they'll do that for you. So I think the mentality is like, oh, I'll get them earlier. But then it's like, they're the most sensitive to, like today it's 70 degrees here today, which is really abnormal for us. And tomorrow it's going to be 27 degrees. So like it just is like those fluctuations. The earliest ones are the ones that are the most prone to that when you're planting them outdoors.
And so what I wanted to highlight is those folks that live in the South can actually, if I'm thinking right, purchase pre-chilled 5-degree bulbs, plant them outside, and they'll bloom for them, right? Because they've reached their cooling period. They just need darkness to set roots.
Yeah, and they could probably do the 9-degree tulips also, because they don't need them to be that quick to be ready to grow. So they might be able to save themselves a little bit of money and do the 9-degree. Like I know Mima at Urban Buds, they plant in an unheated tunnel directly in the ground. And so they use pre-chilled for that reason, to just make sure that even in the unheated tunnel that they're getting enough cooling in that space. And they're in St. Louis. So I think they're the same zone as us. I think that they're like 6A or somewhere.
They're cold. They're cold. You would think, you know what I mean? It's like, don't think in those kinds of winter hardiness zones that they would need cooling. But I mean, when you explain it, it just makes perfectly good sense. So Gretel, we're going to put a link for people to request your PDF download. And what's that all about?
So that has a list of some of our favorite varieties that we've found work best as pre-chilled. So, we've cycled through a lot of different ones in our time of trying to figure out what works best. And there's a ton of tulip varieties out there. And there's also some of the ones that are the easiest to do as pre-chilled are some of those like single early ones like I was talking about. But for us, we try and have specialty varieties, doubles and parrots, and things that are more highly like sought after because they are different. And so trying to share that list with people, just that of what we figured out works best, because some of the varieties are just do better than others. And we've also found that it's best in our different successions to switch it up a little bit. And so when we first started doing it, we were doing the same ones every succession. But then what we found is by the time the outdoor ones are blooming, people have already been seeing those varieties for all of those weeks leading up to it. So they're maybe not as special as outdoors.
Right.
But having a few extra ones on your list of ones you can kind of like rotate through, then maybe make them special again once they're happening outside.
Sure. So just a couple of questions that I think that people are wondering about. So what kind of problems do people run into when they do this? What kind of, is there pest, disease, or what kind of speed bumps do you hit?
Yeah. So I think that if you are somewhere where it's sunny and warm, sometimes getting the later successions of the pre-chilled, they can bloom a little bit shorter, just because if you do get hot in the spring, that can be a challenge. Also, just keeping the crates wet enough but not too wet. So if you think about like outside, like you don't want the crates to constantly be soaked, because as the foliage starts to break through the soil, it kind of creates that little cup. And so you just don't want that to be like holding water all of the time. So you can experience some rot and like issues with mold if you're not properly ventilating your greenhouse, or if you're keeping things just like too wet in there. So those are our biggest issues. We don't typically have a ton of pest like pressure on the tulips. I would just say, if you know that in the spring that you have pressure with other things, just to keep an eye on them. But even if our like anemones or lilies or something get aphids, we haven't really had those issues with the tulips yet. Of course, now that I say something, I should probably
I was going to say, we may not have should have talked about this.
Yeah.
But, and I know the other thing that people are so confused about is Do you save tulip bulbs?
We do not save tulip bulbs. So because what they require is so specific, yeah, they get either put in the compost or when we cut. So when we harvest, we're pulling by the bulb. So we're uprooting them, we're saving them with the bulb on them in the cooler until we need them, which is usually, you can store them for like a week or two, dry in a crate in the cooler. And so because we're uprooting that tulip and when we cut the bulb off, we're not leaving any foliage. So we're not leaving anything for that bulb to regenerate and like synthesize for next year. So we mostly will take those bulbs. We call it gardening farmer style. So we'll take those crates of bulbs, dump them around the property and put mulch on top of them and just kind of like let them become a part of like the landscaping, like along the edge of the roads and things like that. So we joke that it looks like Easter threw up on the side of our driveway because it's like all the like pink and yellow and stuff that are happening. We need to put some orange or purple or something in there just to like lighten it up. But most of them do get composted, or if we have employees or family or whatever that want a crate or so of them, then they can take them. But it usually does take 2 years for them to produce, at least 2 years for them to produce again from that process, because we're not leaving any foliage and you're like ripping them up from the roots.
Right.
So it takes them some time to build up enough energy to bloom again.
So what does the flower look like? What stage do you actually pull them?
So we do pick them a little bit green, so that we can store them. So when we're picking, we have two different grades. Basically, it's either it has a bulb on and it's closed enough that it can be stored, and that goes in one section because those go in crates and go into storage. Or the other grade is either the bulb came off when you picked it, or it's too open and then it needs to go in water, and those are the first ones that need to be used or sold. So we try to get it when they're still a little bit green, but we don't like to pick them too green. It's kind of like a tomato, where it's like if it's picked so green that like it can be shipped or whatever, it has a longer like point in the process, then it never fully matures to as beautiful as it could be if we let it open up a little bit. So it's always a fine line of, like today it's really warm. So we'll go out in the afternoon and pick again in the afternoon just to make sure, because it's warm, that there's not, that stuff didn't like blow open in there. So you want to get them before they open, when they're still closed and when they still have a little bit of green on them. And some, every variety is a little bit different. Like the avant-gardes, they're ones that we really like as a pre-chilled variety. They're like a creamy yellow color. But when they first open, it's like they're green and then they start to crack and then they color up. So like some of them will color up before they crack, and then other ones crack and then they color up. So you kind of like will learn based on variety. You don't want to pick it too tight that it's not gonna color. And I think everybody's different as far as like what your sales outlet is. If you're selling to retail and people want stuff like open for a party like that day, then that's different than selling them to a florist who needs them to sit in their cooler for a few days before they use them, and then like put them in a vase that's then going to last for a week or whatever. So I think it also depends on your sales outlet, but the tighter you get them, the longer that you can store them also.
So what is your cooler temperature?
It's at like between 34 and 36.
Okay. All right.
So get it.
I mean, Everything is so complicated, Gretel. Every flower family has its own set of rules, and it's just very deep and complex. And so Gretel and her husband Steve actually teach a course for us. And when you request her PDF, that will put you on our email list to keep in the know about that. So Gretel, tell them just a little bit, tell them the name of your course and just a little bit about it. And it registers in the fall. So tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so the class we teach is called Growing Cut Flowers in Hoops and Greenhouses. So it talks about unheated and heated greenhouse production, just extending the season. So we start with like choosing your greenhouse and your location and, just sort of the very beginning stages of that, choosing what goes in the greenhouse, talking about crop planning and decision making. And then we start with spring crops, which is what everybody wants to like learn about, and sort of work through the season. So we go from, having flowers for Easter and Mother's Day, having like ranunculus, anemones, stock, snaps, the pre-chilled tulips are a part of that. Go ahead, then having flowers in the summer, things like lisianthus, dusty miller, and then having things in the fall going into Thanksgiving time. So those are like heirloom mums, late dahlias, and there's a lot of other crops in there too. But and then we talk about greenhouse management, which is a really important piece of that. I think that when people go from growing outside in the field to then growing in a greenhouse, it is a totally different like science as far as like you are in control of the weather. So figuring out how to manage that based on the climate where you are and the crop like selection that you have. And then the last week is about pests and diseases and like soil management. So that kind of gets into like the nitty gritty. So it's anywhere from, beginner to advanced. It's got everything in there and you have access to it forever once you buy it. So if it's something that, you're just starting and all of that information sounds really overwhelming, know that you can kind of go back to it as a reference guide when you do experience some of those issues or as you're learning, because we kind of throw everything out there that we've, all of the problems that we've experienced. We've lost a greenhouse to the weight of snow. We have lost crops to diseases and pests and, poor timing and poor greenhouse management. And so these are all things that we've learned along the way. So the goal is, by teaching people this stuff, hopefully they can avoid some of the mistakes that we made and start with the knowledge of the lessons that we've learned.
So if you request her PDF, then you'll get on her email list to get not only more PDFs like the one she's sharing today. She has some great info that she sends out, but will give you a heads up when her course enrolls. So Gretel, thank you so much for opening our eyes to tulips and the potential, particularly of people that have struggled and they're listening to this thinking that's what was wrong with my tulips, to know that there is an option. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And friends, so we are going to wrap it up, and thanks for dropping into another Field and Garden podcast. And remember, you can learn more about the Gardener's Workshop and Steve and Gretel. You can go through our website. They have a page there, as well as we will put social media links below, a link to the PDF, and to more about their course also. So friends, until we meet again, bye Gretel.
Bye, thanks.